My name is Colette Bertschy, and this is a short climate change impact assessment video for Paris, France. Paris is located within the Île-de-France province in northern central France. Within Île-de-France, the Greater Paris region is composed of 8 communes. It covers 2% of France's surface area, but is home to 20% of its population and generates 30% of the country's wealth. The city center consists of 20 districts arranged in a spiral, and is the most densely populated area within Europe. The Paris Basin sits in the center of the Seine's fluvial plain, at a confluence between several rivers. Its central location makes it a busy crossroads for both road and rail networks, and the Seine provides easy access to the sea. Paris is the top economic region in France and generates 5% of the EU's annual GDP. Central Paris has 2.2 million inhabitants, with a notably young and well-qualified population. 40% of the Greater Paris population commutes daily to reach employment within the city center. Today, 80% of Paris residents are employed in tertiary sectors. As tertiary industries have increased, so has the demand for office space, which has led to an expansion of modern office buildings. Paris sits above a network of tunnels, catacombs, and old quarries. The city covers the banks of the Seine and has buildings dating back to the 12th century. Much of the city was remodeled in the 1800s by housemen, whose renovation was responsible for what is now famous Parisian architecture. Paris has a temperate climate with mild but slightly unstable springs and autumns, warm summers, and cool but rarely freezing winters. Annually, Paris averages around 13 degrees centigrade with a seasonal range of 8 degrees. Paris receives approximately 670 millimeters of rainfall annually, relatively evenly distributed between the seasons, but precipitation intensity generally increases during the summer months. Occasionally, Paris suffers from heat waves. There have been 8 heat waves in the Paris Basin between 1951 and 2009, averaging a frequency of 1 every 7 years. The region was particularly scarred in 2003 as the city lost 500 of its elderly people in August. Recently, the frequency of the heat waves in France has been increasing, with temperature spikes recorded in Paris over the past 2 summers. Built along the banks of the Seine, flooding is also a recurring issue for the city. The Great Flood of 1910 holds the record river rise of 8.6 meters. Reservoirs were then built into the Seine's 4 tributaries, but Paris flooded 4 more times before the end of the millennium. More recently, however, the Seine peaked at 6.1 meters in June of 2016 and swelled to 5.85 meters in January 2018 after 2 weeks of intense rainfall. As temperatures rarely drop below freezing, Paris is ill-equipped to cope with snow. Life in the city center was disrupted by record overnight snowfall of 12 centimeters in early February 2018. This year, Paris also suffered a cold wave blown over from Siberia, with snow falling once again on March 19th. Periods of intense rainfall can also flood the highly urbanized capital city. Parisian streets and underground metros were most recently drowned in May 2018 during an unseasonal storm. As our climate changes, France is generally expected to see an increase in the intensity of winter precipitation and experience more summer dry days. In the Paris region, the season with the most intense rainfall will therefore likely shift from summer to winter, and the intensity of precipitation events will generally increase. Over the next century in Europe, total precipitation is expected to increase in the north and decrease in the south. The Paris Basin, located in northern central France, lies near this projected geographical boundary. It therefore seems reasonable to anticipate that the total annual precipitation may remain relatively consistent over the region. As air temperatures rise over the next century, the daily summer maxima and the daily winter minima in France are expected to increase. All of the models point towards summer maxima warming faster than winter minima on a national scale, and to the country experiencing a decrease in the number of winter frost days and an increase in the number of hot days and tropical nights relative to the averages of 1971 to 2000. For Paris, compared to the average temperatures between 1971 and 2006, A1b scenario suggests that by the end of the century the daily winter minima will increase by 2 degrees, and the daily summer maxima will increase by 3.5. A2 scenarios suggest a comparable increase of 2.4 and 5 degrees respectively. Greater temperature increases within Paris as compared to the projected national averages may be anticipated due to urban heat island effects intensifying local warming. As our climate changes due to rising anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions, IPCC projections foreshadow an increase in the number of heatwave-related deaths in Paris, and in the chances of the region's mortality rates exceeding figures from 2003. Though necessary to reduce future heat waves decimating residents, the cooling systems in old Parisian buildings will be costly to update. The young and elderly are particularly vulnerable to overheating, and while Paris has a remarkably low elderly population, the Greater Paris region accounts for 1 out of 4 births in France. Hospitals are particularly vulnerable, with death rates among inpatients usually increasing during heat waves. Patients typically cannot be moved, and significant temperature rises can create issues with drug storage, operations, etc. Paris has several hospitals near the Seine, which are therefore also vulnerable to flooding. By the middle of the century, flood frequencies are expected to increase in Paris, and the underground network of metro stations scattered around the city, as well as the underground low-voltage networks that distribute electricity throughout the city, are particularly vulnerable to inundation. The Île-de-France region is the nation's top electricity consumer, accounting for 15% of France's total consumption. Demand for electricity in the Greater Paris region is rising. 70,000 new homes are being built. The new restricted circulation zones within the city center are pushing residents to shift towards hybrid and electric vehicles. Several data centers have recently been installed in the region, and as temperatures increase, so will demand for air conditioning in the summer. France is the world's largest net electricity exporter, generating a €3 billion annual surplus, so will likely be able to meet the region's rising demand. However, most of the nuclear or thermal electric power stations that supply the Greater Paris region pump their cooling water from the Seine, which is warming and expanding as the air temperatures rise. If the river used for cooling reaches a critical temperature, power plants need to be shut down as they are at risk of overheating. The city's growing, recently implemented centralized cooling system, Urban Cold, also pumps water from the Seine. In fact, half of the water used in the Paris region, for both industry and consumption, is taken from the river. And longer dry periods over the summer are anticipated to create water scarcity issues by the end of the century. By that time, increased water demand, coupled with increased evaporation, is anticipated to decrease overall water drainage and runoff, potentially impacting the groundwater recharge in the Paris basin. Increased summer droughts will also create more favorable conditions for algal blooms, and reduce the dilution of pollution in sewage, increasing health risks for the river-dependent population. A decrease in the Seine's volume may restrict summer access to ships, impacting local trade, tourism, and commerce. As Paris is overwhelmingly dominated by tertiary industries, it is reliant on purchasing and importing all of its food produce. Droughts are also likely to contribute to a decrease in the total national wheat yields, which could impact the price of bread, a fundamental staple to the French and Parisian diet. Paris is a national and international education hub. Year-end exams are traditionally held in July, and as the daily summer maxima increases, so will the heat impacts on the students and the national education averages. High, stagnant temperatures in the city center can correlate with pollution spikes, as the atmospheric temperature gradient inverts more frequently with an increase in tropical nights. Fewer frost days will decrease the risk of Paris's homeless population freezing during the winter months. France is interlocked with several nations, the Atlantic and the Mediterranean Ocean. As the polar vortex weakens with increasing global temperatures, France and Paris will be more vulnerable to weather systems coming across the Atlantic, increasing the frequency of unusual weather events. The anticipated increased precipitation intensity and storm frequency in Paris by the middle of the century will likely increase the number of road and metro inundations, wreaking havoc on the daily commuter lifestyle of 40% of the Greater Paris population. There is concern that vector-borne diseases will spread with rising temperatures. In Paris, there is a particular concern that malaria will be imported by international visitors, be they people, vectors, or hosts, as the high volume of tourists creates a prime opportunity to import fresh cases, and identifying the source of an outbreak would be incredibly difficult. Paris welcomes over 1 million tourists a year, although the concentration of summer visitors is expected to decrease with rising temperatures, which could hurt the local tourist-oriented small businesses, as well as luxury and hospitality industries. In recent years, as Europe has been trying to cope with the migrant crisis since 2015, many refugees and economic migrants have been seeking refuge in Paris. As the impacts of climate change are increasingly felt around the globe, many will look to the relatively sheltered city, with a strong climate action plan, as a potential new home. As the migrant tent camps in Paris can attest, the city infrastructure is not currently prepared to welcome the potential wave of climate refugees in the near future. Over the next several decades in Paris, the frequency of heat waves, unusual weather events, and floods is expected to rise. Flooding will occur either by the Seine overflowing onto its banks or through increasingly intense precipitation events inundating the urban centers. The commuting lifestyle of the Greater Paris residents is at risk, although the Grand Paris public transportation network being installed in the suburbs aims to increase commuter options. The C40 city is proactive and generally ambitious in its approach to climate change, and the city's new Air Quality, Energy, and Climate Action Plan creates zones of restricted circulation aiming to decrease vehicle congestion and the associated NOx air pollution risks that accompany rising temperatures. Old buildings will be costly to renovate to increase resilience, and groundwater recharge in the Paris basin may reduce, potentially triggering future water scarcity by the end of the century. Local tourism, hospitality, and luxury industries may suffer as summer tourists decrease, though Paris's international nature raises risks of malaria outbreaks. Overall, however, Paris seems to be relatively resilient and is putting a lot of effort into anticipating the coming changes within the next several decades.